He drove to Hitler's headquarters to tell him the truth. Hitler dismissed him before he finished speaking. The withdrawal he had requested was not ordered. That winter the German army suffered the casualties he had said it would. He was at home in Germany when it happened. He had been right about everything. The official record calls it a command disagreement, a difference of professional opinion between a general and his supreme commander. The private record is more specific. There was a memo. There was a meeting. There were exact words spoken in a room at Rastenburg on December 20, 1941. Those words are documented by the man who spoke them. Heinz Guderian, General of Panzer Troops, December 1941, the man who had written the doctrine that conquered France in 6 weeks, that put German armored forces at the gates of Moscow. That gave Hitler the war he had wanted, dismissed by the man whose war he had won. What he wrote about that meeting in his memoir was carefully chosen. What the documents show about what happened to his forces in the months before the meeting was not in the memoir at all. Both things are in the archive. Only one of them is in the book. To understand what happened at Rastenburg in December 1940, you have to go back 18 months to France. May 1940, the German armored advance through the Ardennes. Conventional military thinking said the Ardennes was impassable for armored formations. Guderian had been arguing for 3 years that conventional military thinking was wrong. Guderian had developed the theory of armored warfare through the 1930s against institutional resistance. His argument was specific. Tanks should not support infantry, they should replace it. Concentrated armored formations moving faster than the enemy could respond, not at the pace of marching soldiers but at the pace of engines. The breakthrough before the defense could organize. The exploitation before the retreat could consolidate. He had written it down. He had argued it in classrooms. He had been told repeatedly it would not work. In France it worked exactly as he had written it. The Ardennes crossing, the Meuse bridgehead, the dash to the Channel coast that cut the Allied forces in two before they understood what was happening. France fell in 6 weeks. The doctrine that professional military opinion had dismissed for a decade had just won a campaign that the previous war had taken 4 years to produce a comparable result. Hitler called it a miracle. The generals who had opposed the plan claimed credit for it. Guderian was promoted. His photograph appeared in the newspapers. The man who had spent a decade arguing for a doctrine that nobody wanted was now the man whose doctrine had just rewritten the operational history of the war. That credit would not protect him 18 months later. Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union on a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Guderian commanded Panzergruppe II, one of the largest armored formations in the history of warfare. The early advances were extraordinary. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. The distances covered in weeks exceeded anything the doctrine had been tested against in France. The problem was the distances themselves. The supply lines were the constraint. France had been fought across hundreds of kilometers. The Soviet Union was being fought across thousands. The roads that existed deteriorated under the weight of armored vehicles. The railways ran on a different gauge and required conversion. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts were arriving at the front at a fraction of the rate the advance was consuming them. Guderian was writing reports about this from July 1941 onward. The reports are in the archive. The reports document the deterioration precisely. Vehicle availability percentages declining week by week. Fuel consumption versus fuel delivery. The gap between what the advance required and what the supply chain was providing. Guderian was not writing impressions. He was writing numbers. The numbers were getting worse. He sent the reports up the chain of command. He continued the advance. Kiev fell in September 1941. The encirclement produced over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, one of the largest single captures in military history. Hitler declared it a triumph. The advance had produced extraordinary results by any conventional measure. What it had also produced was an army that was now deep inside the Soviet Union with winter approaching, supply lines stretched beyond their capacity, and a new objective. Moscow. Operation Typhoon began on October 2, 1941. The objective was Moscow. The initial advances were significant. Then the autumn rains came. The Soviet roads, unpaved for the most part, turned to mud. The German term for it was Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Vehicles sank. Supply columns stopped moving. The advance slowed to walking pace. Then it stopped. What happened next was never in the official record Germany published after the war. It was not in the state announcements. It was not in the Wehrmacht communiques. What happened next was in the reports. The reports Guderian had been sending since July. and in a specific document he prepared in November 1941 that reached Hitler's headquarters and received no reply. The German army had no winter equipment, no winter uniforms at scale, no winter lubricants for the vehicles, no preparation for temperatures that would reach -40 degrees Celsius in the weeks ahead. The planning had assumed Moscow would fall before winter. Moscow had not fallen, the assumption had not been corrected. The men in the field were wearing summer uniforms in November on the Eastern Front. Guderian prepared a formal assessment in November 1941. It documented the supply situation, the vehicle availability, the casualty rate, the temperature projections. The gap between what the advance to Moscow required and what was available to provide it. The assessment concluded that the army needed to withdraw to defensible winter positions. It was delivered through proper military channels. It received no reply from Hitler's headquarters. He decided to go in person. On December 20, 1941, Guderian drove to Rastenburg, Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. He had requested a meeting. The meeting had been granted. He arrived with the assessment, the numbers, and the request for permission to withdraw to winter positions. What he was about to say had already been committed to paper and ignored. He was going to say it to Hitler's face. Guderian's own account of the Rastenburg meeting is in Panzer Leader, published in 1950. It is one of the most detailed first-person accounts of a direct confrontation with Hitler in the documented record. He describes the meeting in specific terms, what he said, what Hitler said, the sequence of the exchange. The account has been cross-referenced against Franz Halder's contemporaneous war diary entries. The accounts are consistent. He presented the situation on the ground, the supply figures, the casualty rates, the temperature data, the state of the vehicles. He argued that the army needed to withdraw to a shortened defensive line that could be held through the winter with the forces and equipment available. He described what would happen if it did not. Hitler listened. Then Hitler told him the troops must hold their current positions. There would be no withdrawal. The line would be held by willpower. Guderian pushed back. He was one of the few senior commanders who argued directly with Hitler rather than acquiescing. The exchange at Rastenburg on December 20 is documented as lasting several hours. Guderian presented the ground reality. Hitler presented his position. Retreat destroys morale. Retreat becomes rout. The line must hold. Guderian returned to the supply figures. Hitler returned to willpower. The meeting ended. The official account said he was relieved of command due to his unauthorized retreat of certain units without permission during the preceding weeks, a separate tactical disagreement from the Rastenburg meeting itself. What the documented record shows is that he was dismissed on December 26, 1941, 6 days after the Rastenburg meeting. He was told he needed rest for health reasons. He went home to Germany. That winter, the German army suffered what Guderian had said it would suffer. The casualties from cold, from disease, from the Soviet counteroffensive that began in December 1941 were catastrophic. The units that had not been permitted to withdraw to defensible winter positions held their ground at enormous cost. The assessment Guderian had delivered at Rastenburg and in writing before it described the situation with precision. He was at home, he had been right. He was still the man who had written the doctrine. The man whose Panzergruppe had taken Kiev, had reached the gates of Moscow, had proved in France that everything the institution had told him was wrong about armored warfare was in fact right. He had not changed. What had changed was that he had told the truth about what the situation required, and the man who needed to hear it had dismissed him for saying it. Franz Halder's war diary is one of the most important primary sources of the Eastern Front campaign. Halder was chief of the General Staff. He documented the command decisions of 1941 and 1942 in contemporaneous handwritten entries. His entries for December 1941 record the Guderian dismissal, the command arguments preceding it, and his own assessment of the strategic situation. Halder himself was dismissed by Hitler in September 1942, 9 months after Guderian, for the same category of offense, telling the truth about the situation on the ground. The pattern Guderian's dismissal established repeated itself across the senior German officer corps for the next 3 years. Commanders who told Hitler the situation on the ground contradicted his assessment were dismissed. Commanders who agreed with Hitler or said nothing were retained until they too told him something he did not want to hear. By 1944, Hitler had dismissed or forced the resignation of nearly every senior commander who had served in the early campaigns. The ones who remained were the ones who had learned not to present accurate assessments. Guderian was recalled to active duty in February 1943, 14 months after his dismissal, as the German military situation deteriorated following Stalingrad. He was given a role developing the armored forces rather than commanding them. In July 1944, after the July 20 assassination attempt, he was appointed Chief of the General Staff. He held the position until March 1945, when Hitler dismissed him again, for the same reason as the first time. His second dismissal in March 1945 followed an argument about the Eastern Front that bore precise structural similarity to the first. He told Hitler the military situation required a specific response. Hitler disagreed. Guderian continued arguing. Hitler dismissed him. The pattern that had begun at Rastenburg in December 1941 had reproduced itself exactly 40 months later. The war ended 6 weeks after his second dismissal. Guderian was captured by American forces in May 1945. He was held as a prisoner of war and interrogated by Allied investigators. The interrogation transcripts are held at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. He discussed the Moscow campaign, the Rastenburg meeting, and the command structure of the Wehrmacht in considerable detail. He was not indicted at Nuremberg. He was released in 1948. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the senior political and military leadership of the Nazi state. Guderian was not among the defendants. The decision not to indict him has been discussed by historians since. The forces he commanded in 1941 operated in the context of the Commissar Order, Hitler's directive requiring the summary execution of captured Soviet political officers. The implementation of that order by forces under his command during the 1941 advance is documented in the operational records. It does not appear in Panzer Leader. The Commissar Order was issued before Barbarossa began. It required German forces to execute captured Soviet political commissars rather than treat them as prisoners of war. Not all commanders implemented it. Some documented their noncompliance. Guderian's memoir does not address the order or its implementation by his forces. The operational records of Panzergruppe II from 1941 are in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg. They have been examined by historians. The picture that emerges from those records is not the picture presented in Panzer Leader. Panzer Leader was published in West Germany in 1950 and translated into English in 1952. It was adopted as required reading at military academies in Britain, the United States, and West Germany. Guderian's analysis of armored doctrine, operational planning, and command decision-making became foundational texts for NATO military education in the Cold War period. The book is in its multiple editions. It is still assigned reading. The chapters on 1941 describe the supply problems, the command disagreements, and the Rastenburg confrontation. They do not describe what the operational records show about the implementation of the Commissar Order. Historians who have cross-referenced Panzer Leader against the operational records have documented the gap. The memoir presents Guderian as a professional soldier who disagreed with Hitler on operational grounds, was proved right, and suffered for his professional honesty. The operational records present a more complete picture. Both are in the archive. The memoir is in the library. The operational records require a researcher's credentials and a visit to Freiburg. Guderian died on May 14, 1954 in Schwangau, Bavaria. He was 65 years old. The first edition of Panzer Leader had been in print for 4 years. The operational records of Panzergruppe II from 1941 were in the Bundesarchiv. The Halder War Diary was in the archive. The U.S. Army interrogation transcripts were in Washington. The Rastenburg meeting of December 2019, 41 was documented in all of them. The officers who studied Panzer Leader at military academies in the 1950s and 1960s learned the doctrine from the man who invented it. They learned about the command disagreements with Hitler. They learned about the Rastenburg confrontation and the dismissal. They learned about being right and being fired for it. They did not learn about the operational records of 1941 from the book they were assigned. Those records required a different kind of reading. The doctrine he wrote is in every modern army's thinking about armored warfare. The operational records of what his forces did in 1941 are in Freiburg. The memoir is in the library. The Halder Diary is in the archive. The Rastenburg meeting of December 2019, 41 is documented by everyone who was there. What he chose to put in the book and what he chose to leave out of it are both in the record. The record does not explain itself. At White, he drove to Hitler's headquarters on December 2019, 41 to tell him the truth about the Eastern Front. Hitler dismissed him. The truth he told was in writing before the meeting. It is still in writing now. The casualties he predicted followed exactly as he said they would. The men who died that winter in positions they were not equipped to hold did not know his name when he made his argument. They found out afterwards. Most of them did not find out at all. The Halder diary entry for December 1941 is in the Bundesarchiv. It records the dismissals, the command arguments, and Halder's own assessment of what the winter would bring. He was right too. He was dismissed 9 months later. The diary he kept during those 9 months is in the same archive as the diary entries about Guderian. The pattern Halder documented about someone else repeated itself in his own record. The front held that winter, not through willpower alone, through the sacrifice of the men in the positions that were not permitted to withdraw. The Soviet counteroffensive was eventually stopped. Hitler claimed his halt order had saved the army. Some historians have agreed that an uncontrolled retreat might have produced a worse result than the positions held. The men who died in those positions are not available to assess the alternatives. Guderian's assessment of what the winter required is in the document he submitted before December 20. It is also not available for comment. The U.S. Army interrogation transcripts from 1945 are held at the Center of Military History in Washington. Guderian discussed the Rastenburg meeting in the transcripts. He described the exchange with Hitler in terms consistent with his later memoir account. He described the dismissal. He described his view of the command structure and the decision-making process that led to the winter crisis. He described what he had argued for and what had been refused. The transcripts and the memoir say the same things. The operational records in Freiburg add what neither of them mention. He wrote Panzer Leader between 1948 and 1950 while being held as a prisoner of war and after his release. He had access to his own notes and to some documents. He wrote what he chose to write. The book presents the argument he had made throughout his career, that armored doctrine properly applied wins wars, and the argument he had made at Rastenburg, that the army needed to withdraw. Both arguments were correct. The book presents a man who was professionally right and institutionally punished for it. That account is accurate. It is also incomplete. Panzer Leader is still in print. It is still assigned reading at military academies. The doctrine it describes remains foundational to modern armored warfare thinking. The man who wrote it drove to Hitler's headquarters on December 20, 1941, and told him the truth about the Eastern Front. Hitler dismissed him. The truth he told was documented before and after the meeting by multiple independent sources. The rest of what the 1941 campaign produced is in the operational records. The book does not go there. The operational records of Panzergruppe II from 1941 are in Freiburg. The Halder War Diary is in Freiburg. The dismissal order is in Freiburg. The document Guderian submitted before the Rastenburg meeting is in Freiburg. The book he wrote that does not include all of them is in the library. Both the library and the archive have been open since the war ended. The distance between them is the distance between the account a man chose to give of himself and the account the record gives of him. He died in Schwangau on May 14, 1954. The book was in its third printing. The archive was in Freiburg. The men who had died that winter in positions they had not been equipped to hold had been dead for 12 years. The doctrine he wrote is still taught. The distance between what he wrote and what the records show has been in the archive the whole time. He drove to Rastenburg to tell Hitler the truth. Hitler dismissed him. The truth is in the archive. The book is in the library. He chose what went in the book. He did not choose what went in the archive.